Good afternoon. Our next speaker, Mr. Stanton Friedman, is a nuclear physicist, author, and lecturer. He's earned his BS and MSc degrees in physics from the University of Chicago in 1955 and 1956. He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist by such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse Astronuclear Laboratory, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas Astronautics. During this time, he worked in highly advanced, classified, eventually canceled programs that dealt with nuclear aircraft, fission, and fusion rockets, as well as various compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial applications. Friedman became interested in UFOs in 1958. Since 1967, he's lectured about them at more than 600 colleges and 100 professional groups in all 50 of the United States, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries. He's published more than 19 UFO papers. He's appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs, including Larry King 4 times in many documentaries. On a personal note, even though I try not to give these in introductions, when I was 15 years old and I had not started into the UFO field yet, I wrote almost every big name, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I wrote every big name out there to essentially learn. And one of them was Stanton Friedman. And if you could believe it, because I think this is important, it speaks to the man that I'm about to bring onto the stage and his character and how much he cares about this topic. He was the only one that wrote me back. And it was that motivation that led me to create what I did, and here I am 19 years later. And as much as I don't want to put him on the spot, I do have him to thank for it. So it's always an honor for me to bring to the stage Stanton Friedman.
I can't tell you how many MUFON symposia I've been to because I can't count that high. But I've always enjoyed coming to them. And I get to see the country a little bit too. We have a difficult question today. How do you make ufology respectable? Maybe I should have said more respectable, because I don't review it, I don't think of ufology as unrespectable or disrespectful or anything like that. But I think sometimes we're our own worst enemy, those of us who have a serious interest in this subject, because we bought into the nonsense of the nasty, noisy negativists. We think most people don't believe in flying saucers. We think mentioning that we're interested is going to put the kibosh on all future respectable activities we have. That's nonsense. I've been at this a long time. I think I can express my sentiments very clearly. I am not a masochist. I've enjoyed doing what I'm doing, and I come on strong. Some of you may be aware that I am not one of these casual guys that I think maybe, possibly, there is some chance that maybe some of these things are of extraterrestrial origin. That's not where I'm coming from. I take a stand. 4 quick conclusions. Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. Governments are covering up. There are no good arguments against the reality of flying saucers, and it's the biggest story that the media is ignoring, along with many of the people in the public. So I tell it like it is. Now, I would say that there are some basic rules for those of you who want to get involved in ufology. First, have facts in hand before putting computer or mouth in gear. That's a very important rule. Second, do not apologize for your interest. Don't be an apologist ufologist. There's no good to be gained, and there's a lot of good to be lost. Don't just tell people the truth, show them. They don't believe there are classified documents? Show them some of the NSA documents on which you can read 1 sentence per page. after the first 100 pages, they'll be convinced that there's a lot of stuff being withheld. Most important, we have a responsibility, whether it's as members of MUFON or just somebody expressing an opinion. The basic rule is do your homework. Don't let the debunkers catch you in saying things which aren't true. They do all of that. We have many examples of opinions being expressed that are not based on facts or data or solid information. We don't need to do that. One thing you can do to be of assistance to the press and the scientific community is give them lists of things. Do your homework. Look up all the opinion polls on UFOs. There's a chapter in my book, Flying Saucers and Science, about the poll results, what the public believes. Why isn't there any scientific work? Give them a list of the dozen or more PhD theses that have been done. You may be surprised. I frequently used to talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and I'd check my audience, and typically fewer than 2% have read any of them. Don't you be among those 2% who haven't read anything. The debunkers have a strong habit. 4 basic rules. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier, and nobody will know the difference anyway. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is a lot more trouble, and nobody will know the difference anyway. Those are basic rules if you want to join the Debunkers Society. And the last thing is that we seem to live in a world that is sort of anti-nuclear, or at least doesn't want to be bothered with thinking about things nuclear. That's bad stuff, you know, nuclear weapons. We live in a nuclear world, whether you like it or not. The energy of the sun and all the other stars in our galaxy and all the other galaxies, to the best of our knowledge, is derived from nuclear fusion reactions. Now, we're so smart, we didn't figure that out until 1938, sorry. But that doesn't mean that those stars weren't fusioning before we figured it out. That's not the test of reality. If we don't know it, it can't be true. It means you have to learn. That's a habit a lot of people don't have. Assume we know everything. If that were true, we would know about it, say the debunkers. Well, we don't need to say that. I'll be talking more about some things nuclear. It's not just that the stars produce their energy that way, and it's not just that nuclear weapons release an incredible amount of energy, but nuclear energy can be used to get to the stars. And our visitors are well aware that we have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. Fortunately, only 2 on people, which is kind of nice, that it isn't more than 2 yet. Now, everybody talks about Roswell. I'm the original civilian investigator, and I'm still talking about Roswell, and that dates back to the 70s. But if you're going to talk about Roswell, get your facts straight. 2 important people in this picture. Let me see if I can work this fancy thing that we have here. There ought to be an arrow coming up someplace. There we go. This is General Roger Ramey, who was head of the 8th Air Force in 1947, and Colonel Thomas Jefferson Dubose, colonel at that time. He was his aide. Ramey was head of the 8th Air Force. The 509th at Roswell was part of the 8th Air Force. Well, the fix was in. This is phony wreckage. Has nothing to do with Roswell. It's from a radar reflector weather balloon combination. Any 3-year-old could tear that foil-like material Any 4-year-old could break those balsa wood beams, if you will. The remarkable thing about the Roswell wreckage, of course, is that the foil couldn't be torn by anybody. That it could be crumpled and uncrumple on its own, which is kind of a neat trick. It didn't look anything like this. I should add, that's Tommy DuBose a lot of years later. I got information directly from him. I managed to locate him. I didn't know whether he was alive or not, but I presumed as an officer at that time after the war, he'd probably gone to West Point, checked with West Point. Oh yeah, he's still alive. He's in Florida. They didn't tell me where, but I found him. If you're going to look for somebody, make sure it's not John Smith. There are too many of them. I found Tommy DuBose. I met with him on more than one occasion. His long interview with him in Recollections of Roswell, which has firsthand testimony from more than 20 people involved, all of whom are dead. And you say, how convenient, now we can't interview him. Sorry about that, I don't know how to resurrect him. Tommy was a good guy. And he told me, standing right next to me, he remembers that press conference. He talked to Ramey's boss, General McMullen, who gave him 3 orders. They knew each other, both West Pointers, incidentally. So was Ramey, so was Colonel Blanchard at Roswell. Tommy told me that McMullen gave him 3 orders. 1, get the press off our backs. I don't care how you do it. 2, send some of that wreckage up here today with one of your Colonel Couriers, here meaning Washington, D.C., from Fort Worth, Texas. And 3, I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing? No, sir. And people have asked me, why didn't DuBose complain or resist? The chain of command. Here's a 2-star general telling a colonel, both West Pointers, to do something. You don't say, well, I don't feel like doing that, General. You want me to jump? How high? And people don't seem to understand that. Anyway, there's an important point here. Find as many first-hand people as you can. There's Colonel Blanchard. Now, he was dead when I started this research, so there was no way I could talk to him, but I talked to his first and second wife, his daughter, son, and talked to other people about him. And you will hear nonsense that he was a loose cannon. They don't tell you, he got 4 more promotions from when he was at Roswell to a 4-star general. Along the way, he had control of thousands of nuclear weapons. He was Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force when he died of a massive heart attack right at the Pentagon. So here we have the debunker saying, just a loose cannon. Don't pay any attention to him. 4-star generals, Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force are hardly loose cannons. Let's hope they're not anyway, I guess you have to say. He was quite a guy. Now, I can't tell people, you really should read the Roswell report, Case Closed. I hated reading it, frankly. This has one of the last explanations for Roswell. We first have flying saucer. Then we have weather balloon radar reflector. Then we have Mogul's super secret balloon. And then we have the granddaddy of them all, crash test dummies. Now, they were dropped all over New Mexico, and we in the Air Force found out about it, and that's what happened. They showed the same map of locations where the dummies were dropped. None of those dummies were dropped anywhere near where the Roswell event happened, near Corona, or near where the Plains of San Augustine event happened. And they did make a big thing. I'll come back to this. Well, I thought I had a picture of the, I don't, This is the video or DVD with firsthand testimony, 27 witnesses. There is such testimony is the point. If you're going to talk about Roswell, you ought to listen to it. Don't let the debunkers say that this isn't true or that isn't true or stuff like that. This book is by Jesse Marcel Jr., Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr., Colonel Jesse Marcel Jr. Funny how I've heard those important facts left out when he was introduced on the Peter Jennings show. Mockumentary, I call it. Of course, I'm angry. I was interviewed for an hour, and I got 20 seconds, and I was called a promoter twice. Sometimes the media will do that. And I was disappointed because Peter Jennings is also a Canadian and an American. And we were both born on July 29th, different years. I expected better from him. I didn't get it. But this is a good book to read. Jesse was a pretty special guy. He died last year. There's the incriminating photograph. The one in the middle is the dummy. You will notice that it is in Air Force gear. That's not for show. You're dropping this out of an airplane at maybe 40,000 feet. What you're wearing will have an important effect on the heating, the drag, the overall flight path, all that sort of thing. The man on the right was in charge of the program, Colonel Madsen. Funny that the Air Force didn't talk to him. I had no trouble finding him in New Mexico. I met with him in person. He stressed to me not only that none of the dummies were dropped until 6 years after Roswell, but the whole point of the program is that the dummies had to be 6 foot tall and 175 pounds, the prototypical pilot, if you will. And incidentally, when they hit the ground, often an arm or a leg came off. Now, we're supposed to believe that these were time-traveled to 1947 and that anybody, rancher at Roswell who found these would think that we're being invaded by aliens. 6 feet tall and 175 pounds and made out of wood. I mean, how absurd can you get? Now, the New York Times didn't talk to Colonel Madsen either. He wasn't hard to find. He was in the phone book in New Mexico. He's gone now, not surprisingly. But get the first-hand information. Okay, other important points here. One of the biggest arguments, there are several big arguments made. You can't get here from there. Governments can't keep secrets. There is no evidence. Can you get here from there? Well, not on a bicycle or a skateboard. You know, it's like saying, now, we know that the time it takes to move around the planet Earth, to circumnavigate the globe, is 3 years. And how do we know that? Well, that's how long it took Magellan's ship. But that was in 1523. Are we stuck with that technology? No. Let's come to realize that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. I don't use a slide rule anymore. I did when I started work in industry. I've been in a class where nobody in the class knew what a slide rule was. Makes me feel a little ancient, but I am, so that's okay. But the future is not an extrapolation of the past. The space station goes around the Earth in less than 100 minutes. There's a big difference between 100 minutes and 3 years because the technology is different. And anybody's a fool who thinks we know all the technological developments that are possible. Look what your kids can work with, and look what we used 50 years ago. quite different. If I had stood up in public 60 years ago and said there'll be a time when we'll be linked to a few billion people in the world and able to talk to them instantly by sitting at our desk with a small piece of equipment, we're talking about the internet and a PC, you'd say, lock him up, this guy's crazy. If you look at the book by Kathleen Martin and myself, Science Was Wrong, you'll find loads of examples of prominent scientists telling you something was impossible. It happened pretty quickly thereafter. Don't believe the prophets of doom and gloom. Smartest astronomer in the country said, if there's one thing he's sure of, men will never fly any distance in a vehicle. Simon Newcomb. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. The British Astronomer Royal in 1956 said, space travel is utter bilge. You can find it in Time magazine. It was a year before Sputnik. There are numerous other examples. So don't put your foot in your mouth by saying this or that is impossible. How do you get here from there? Well, one way is to use the major source of energy in the universe, nuclear fusion. Is that a new idea? At Aerojet General Nucleonics, we had a $9 million contract from the United States Air Force in 1962 to look at fusion propulsion for deep space travel. Paper was published, scientific journal, it's referenced in my books. That's 1962. Yes, travel to the stars is feasible. What we didn't answer was the question, how the heck do you find all the money it's going to take to build that system? Money is part of the problem here. And it's one of the difficulties when you start talking to the ancient academics and fossilized physicists who think that all research is done in academia and published in peer-reviewed journals. I'm sorry, but that's not true. It's very far from true. A good example might be, let's see, what isn't done? Well, the stealth aircraft was designed in secret in 10 years by Lockheed at a cost of $10 billion. That's not a professor and 6 grad students. When I was working on nuclear airplanes at General Electric, people look at me when I say nuclear airplanes, what are you talking about? We didn't successfully fly one, but in 1958, we spent $100 million on that program. That was a lot of money in 1958. We employed 3,500 people. 1,100 of them were engineers and scientists. Again, we're not talking about half a dozen faculty members and a dozen grad students. It was a good job. I saw the handwriting on the wall. I got out and the program was canceled, but that's what my life has been. I can't predict the future either, but I can tell you that there will be new technology, and I can tell you that we've operated fission nuclear rockets too, as well as fusion. Now, I'll admit it isn't on the front page of the New York Times, but then there's a lot of stuff that isn't on the front page of the New York Times. I've had people say to me, governments can't cover things up with the internet and YouTube. You can't hide anything, Stan. Come on. Really? Why is it I don't believe that? Well, I could show you 156 pages of NSA top secret Umbre UFO documents on which you can read one sentence per page. Yeah, they're covering up. Lots of stuff's being covered up. Do you realize that our first spy satellite, Corona spy satellite, incidentally, and I've often wondered whether there's a connection between that and the location of the Roswell crash, which was Corona. There were 12 unsuccessful launches before number 13 was successful. Those were in the 60s, just before in 1960 anyway. The first successful one, which we were told absolutely nothing about, got more data on all the Soviet technological developments, if you will, airfields, et cetera, than all the U-2 flights that preceded it. It wasn't announced publicly. The Russians knew it was flying. They weren't going to say anything until 1990. Can't keep secrets. There was a lot of money that went into that program. I still get a kick out of the way they got the data back. Kodak developed new cameras in secret. They filmed it, and they deorbited the film. Shot it away, went down into the atmosphere, and airplanes came by in the sky and picked it up. What do you do for a living? Well, I net spy satellite film packages. I know it sounds crazy, but it worked. And it probably helped us evade a war, because we had thought the Russians had a lot more stuff going on than they did. It was a relief to know that they didn't. There are a lot of things the government covers up. Some of it's intelligence data. The Washington Post 3 years ago said that the total military intelligence budget for the United States that year was $52.6 billion. CIA, NSA, and another big agency like the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. The total military budget on the planet this year is only $1 trillion. Some of that's classified, no question about that. Now, this ridicule business. I've given over 700 lectures. I've had 11 hecklers, 2 of whom were drunk. You get that many if you talk about sports, religion, politics. And I've had several people say, you get more than that, Stan. But it's okay. I come on strong. I've been on radio and television programs all over. I'm not 6'6" and a threatening figure who will throttle anybody who gives him a hard time. But I don't have to worry. Even the press coverage, it's not always accurate. I've only had one article in which somebody was definitely nasty to me in the article. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me, somebody once said when I was a youngster. Does the public believe? Tell you an experiment I did in a class at a college. Professor cooperated. I said, I want you to vote to the students in the class. I want you to vote with your hands and to close your eyes so you won't be influenced by the other students around, and your professor will count the votes. 80% said they thought most people didn't believe in flying saucers. 80% of that group did believe in flying saucers. There's a cognitive dissonance here, if you want to call it that. It is okay to hold a pro-UFO opinion. It's the rational thing to do because it's based on facts and data. Don't believe the nasty, noisy negativists who say there are no facts and no data that supports that conclusion. And if you can't handle a little ridicule, you need to grow up a little bit. We'd still be thinking the world was flat because the people who said it was round were getting a hard time on occasion. And there have been loads of pronouncements from outstanding scientists about what is impossible. The title of our book, Science Was Wrong, was originally, It's Impossible, Isn't It? The publisher changed it, so he had the right to do that. But don't worry about ridicule. You'll survive if you have the facts in hand before putting your mouth in gear. Now, I mentioned nuclear fusion. I'm a hustler for nuclear fusion, if you will. We didn't figure out until 1936 that that's what produces all the energy in all those stars. That's not very long ago, less than 100 years ago. We didn't demonstrate it until several years after that. And we've made a real progression here. If you think things don't change with time, look at 3 numbers. 1944, a big bomb released the energy of 10 tons of TNT. They call that a blockbuster. Took a big B-29 to carry it. That was in 44. 45, we set off our first atomic bomb released the energy of more than 15,000 tons of TNT. We were just getting started. 1952, first hydrogen bomb fusion device released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. We were just getting started. The Russians' biggest went off at releasing the energy of more than 50 million tons of TNT in one lousy bomb. I say lousy because I'm not proud to be part of a planet in which you set off bombs releasing that much energy. And if you wonder why would aliens come here, maybe it's to want to make sure that we don't take our brand of friendship out there. Friendship defined by how big a bomb you can build. But think of that. 44, 10 tons. 45, 15,000 tons. 52, 10 million tons, and several years thereafter, 50 million tons of TNT, energy release equivalent. Those are shocking numbers. These are some of the fusion reactions. There are lots of them. And you'll hear arguments from people who should know better saying, well, one professor I'm thinking of now, there's no way to get the particles to go the direction you want them to go. Of course there is. You use charged particles and not neutrons. That 18.3 MeV, million electron volts. Normal everyday life, the reactions involve a few electron volts, maybe 10. One fusion reaction, 18 million electron volts. Here are some of the other reactions. But the point is, this is reality. It's not something new. We figured out how to produce a heck of a lot of energy. The first H-bomb, the fireball, was 3 miles in diameter. We Earthlings have a lot of energy at our fingertips. I worry about some of the people who have their fingers at the buttons to release that energy, but that's a different problem. This is a nuclear fission rocket. It's not a model. This one was built by Aerojet General, the XE-1. Liquid hydrogen is pumped through a nuclear reactor, which is down at the bottom of this thing, and exhausted out the nozzle that you see down at the bottom. Power level, 1,000 megawatts. The power of Hoover Dam is 2,000 megawatts. This was Aerojet's. Interesting. This is a radioisotope thermoelectric generator. It's at the other extreme. Small device about this big. That spacecraft that went by Pluto took over 9 years to get there. The energy was produced by a little device like this. Not solar power. I couldn't find any press coverage that mentioned, oh yeah, there's a little radioisotope thermoelectric generator there. People are afraid to talk about it, I guess. All our deep space probes use these devices, dozens of them. Now, one of the things that I get asked, why in the heck would anybody come here if it wasn't just to land on a White House lawn and say, hi, folks, we're from afar. Greetings. Well, I can think of a lot of reasons. Why do people go anywhere? Think of all those gold miners, or would-be gold miners back in the 49er era. Thousands of people went west. It wasn't easy. No airplanes. For many of them, it wasn't on trains either, to get gold. Why do people go to that desert place out there? I think they call it Las Vegas. It's not for, well, it's for gold, you might say. Think about all the reasons people travel. But I would say the first duty of any government is to protect the security of its citizens. And one of the things you don't want to have happen is some alien civilization come your way and drop a bomb on you. That happened in 1941, December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. Some of you may recall that. Quite a shock. Because we knew, incidentally, funny note, not very funny, but on November 29th, 1941, was the Army-Navy football game. Big event. And in the program for the football game was a picture of the USS Arizona, huge battleship. And in the text it said, nobody has ever sunk a big ship from the sky. 8 days later was Pearl Harbor Day. 1,100 men went to their grave on the USS Arizona. The Japanese knew you could sink a ship from the sky. So why would they come here? To make sure we don't go there. If you were an alien, would you want us out there? I don't think so. But it means you got to keep your eyes open for the idiots to be descending on you. I say idiots. If you spend $1 trillion a year on things military and thousands of kids die every single day of preventable disease or starvation, isn't that a definition of idiocy? That's the way it is. So the first reason for coming here would be to quarantine us. Those of you who've read Bob Salas's book about control of nuclear weapons at Minuteman missile launch facilities know that it's happened, as reported by people who go through psychological testing because you don't want a guy with his finger on the button who might be a little nutty or nasty or any other bad word you can think of. It's clear that aliens are concerned about us. That's one reason for coming here, to make sure we don't go out there. And I can't blame them for that. But let's be more practical. This will sound strange. Perhaps you don't know, the Earth is the densest planet in the solar system. I don't mean the people, that's a different question. But a cubic foot of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any other planet in our solar system. And you say, so what, Stan? What difference does it make? Well, that means there are more heavy metals here. Osmium, rhenium, platinum. And heavy metals are rare in the universe, we know from studying the spectra of stars. Those have special properties. Maybe you don't realize it, but you know what uranium was used for 100 years ago? Coloring agent for dinnerware. Yellow, incidentally. Good yellow. That's illegal now, incidentally, because the material is radioactive. What I'm saying is, here's something that we had no idea what it was going to be used for 100 years later. The nuclear navy uses zirconium. Air Force SR-71 uses titanium. Not a lot going on for zirconium in the normal everyday lives we lead, not even for titanium. It's getting more. We had to develop a whole new technology for military applications. That's the zirconium's the heart of the nuclear reactors in the Navy. What I'm saying is it would be perfectly normal for the Galactic Federation to be concerned about any rogue civilization that decides to go popping about and that has the ability to drop huge nuclear weapons on wherever they go. And remember that the weapons coincide with the ability to get there from here. Fusion will do the job. I'm not saying there's nothing better. There probably is, judging by the history of science. But it's already good enough to get us to the stars. Oh, another thing. There are some people who say, well, look, our planet was only created 4004 BC, 6,000 years ago. There isn't time for anybody to have developed advanced technology, right? Wrong. They left 6 zeros out of that. It's like 4 billion years ago that the planet and other stars as much as 13 billion years ago. Plenty of time, considering the short time between when we first discovered even the neutron, 1932, till we exploded an H-bomb, 1952. That's a very short time. So there's plenty of time for other guys. I hate to say that, but we're undoubtedly not the most advanced civilization in the neighborhood. You knew that already. Why would the most advanced civilization behave in the terrible way we behave? Or how do you define advanced? Well, I'm sure in the history books at school you all learned that in World War II, we nice guys killed 50 million of our own kind. That's not an error. It's not 5 million. It's 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities, mostly through bombing. Not a nice way to kill a lot of people. We have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. As I said, the military budget on the planet this year is $1 trillion. Now stand back and look at this place. You'd have to give it a failing grade for being civilized, wouldn't you? I think so. You judge a civilization by its behavior. How does it spend its money? Not very well, I'm afraid. Okay, so why visit? Well, I mentioned quarantine. Hey, maybe we're a penal colony. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. Maybe we serve as a penal colony for 10 different civilizations, each setting up their own little colony. Maybe that explains why there are several different races, different colors, different languages. It's a crazy place. Those of you who are connected with colleges know that people do their thesis research on all kinds of crazy things. Earth would be a great place to do thesis research. Languages, behavior, history. And as I said, they may be stealing our resources. You know, just look at the visits to the New World after Columbus. People from speaking many different languages, coming from many different places, and for many different purposes. To convert the heathen, to steal the gold, to steal the vegetables. After all, potatoes, tobacco, whole new industries developed out of that. There are a lot of different reasons we can think of. I've asked audiences in the past on occasion, how many of you had your great-grandparents living here? Not many, usually. So migration, colonization. My grandparents all came over after 1900, not that long ago. Now, another thing that gets done is we hear the SETI cultists, SETI stands for Silly Effort to Investigate, you know that already, talk about the vast distances. Compared to what? Well, Frank Drake talked about there might be somebody as close as 500 light years away. Really? And then another SETI person said, when we make contact, it will be the greatest discovery in man's history, and they may help us solve our problems. Hey, out there, we got a problem. They get the message 500 years later, send back a message, what can we do for you? Now it's 1,000 years later. Does that make any sense? Well, the reason I bring this up is, let's face it, within 54 light years of here, there are about 2,000 stars. And some of them have next-door neighbors. Think of Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, the source for the Betty and Barney Hill aliens. Those two planets the stars around those two planets, those two stars, in the constellation of Reticulum, which you can't see from here. I wish I could go out, say, and at night and point, say, that's where they're from. I can't do that. You can't see them until you get below the equator. But those two stars, sun-like stars, are only 1/8 of a light year apart. They're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. So what do you mean when you say vast distances? Some of them may cover only a short distance. I have to presume that interstellar travel is much more likely when you got a close neighbor. You can immediately, by looking at it, it's visible all day long, incidentally, and you can tell a lot about what's going on the surface of that planet from the other one. So why worry about vast distances? How about close distance? But you never hear the SETI people talk about stars with close neighbors. I mean, airplanes don't take off and say, where should we go today, folks? They've got destinations in mind, usually heavily inhabited places. Like, what's that big city around here? Los Angeles, I think it's called. More flights to Los Angeles than to Orange County. So we don't see SETI talking about, well, let's look at all the stars that have other neighbors within, say, 5 light years or 10 light years or a bunch. That might be where you'd want to focus your attention. Now, this is the Betty and Barney Hill star map work. And the numbers have changed because for many years we had lousy data on the distances to the stars because no astronomers were going anywhere. What difference does it make how far away it is? We know 2 angles to look at a star. Who cares whether it's 10 light years or 20 light years or 30 light years? So the numbers have changed here. But it shows that just a small sample of space, you have at least a pair of stars that are much closer than the sun is to the next door neighbor. And we need to be realistic, in other words. This is all discussed, the star map work, in the book Captured, mostly by my co-author. She did most of the writing, Kathleen Martin. The key word here, again, is that progress comes from doing things differently. Let's not look backwards, let's look forward. We want to make ufology respectable. We have to recognize the real world in which we live, in which progress does come from doing things differently. Not only in how many people you can kill with a bomb, maybe how many kids you can feed with new agricultural techniques might be a more interesting question. That would be doing something different, wouldn't it? Clean water for most of the poor people of the planet? We don't want to do that. I mean, of course, California needs some water too, but I don't know how to provide that either. Now, there is no evidence, Stan. I've heard that. Here's a copy of Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. Largest study ever done for the United States Air Force. Way back in 1955. They didn't distribute the report, they distributed a press release. That's the American way. What did they say? Here's what the Secretary of the Air Force said. Don't tell me there's no evidence for government lies. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. That was the Secretary of the Air Force. What higher authority could you have? Notice the date, 25 October 1955. Now, what's wrong with that statement? It's a total lie. Yes, I'm accusing a cabinet rank officer of lying to the American public. I know that comes as a shock to you. because governments don't lie, right? Here's the categorization of 3,201 sightings discussed in Blue Book Special Report 14. Notice the last line. The unknowns, which are the only ones we're interested in, gee, that doesn't look like 3%. It's 21.5%. That's not even 3 rounded off. Notice the next to the last line. Insufficient information, wholly separate category, another 9.3%. Now, the third line from the bottom is supposed to be psychological aberrations, but it wouldn't fit. Crackpot cases. Oh, there are lots of them, you'll hear. Really? 1.5%. The American Physical Society, of which I and most physicists are members, Bob Lazar is not a member, don't worry about it, says that 2% of the papers submitted to it by members of the American Physical Society are crackpot papers. That means there's more crackpots associated with physics than with flying saucers. I'm one of the few with a foot in each camp, you'll understand. But these are facts. Don't let anybody tell you, oh, most of the sightings are crackpot cases. There aren't any good sightings. Well, some people have made comments like that. Here's the quality evaluation. The best sightings are the ones in the top line. 35% of the excellent cases could not be identified. Only 18% of the poor cases. You know, if I told you that, gee, I tried a bunch of drugs and they won't cure that disease you have because only 18% work or 35% work, you'd say, hey, that's what I want. I'm sick. Give me the right medicine. So the question isn't, are all UFOs alien spacecraft? The question is, are any? The answer is very definitely yes. This is the breakdown by quality, but you wouldn't know it from reading the comments that my college classmate Carl Sagan made. I think I have a picture of them, but no scientific data? Well, Symposium on UFOs. Not sponsored by MUFON, you understand. This is a congressional symposium. Committee on Science and Astronautics, House of Representatives. 12 scientists testified in person. I was one of the 12, the youngest and the only one still alive. Some very good papers there. Don't let anybody tell you there's no good evidence. James E. McDonald published his paper, 71 pages long, more than 41 excellent cases. He was a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. His specialty was atmospheric physics. And gee, the great majority of UFOs are seen in the atmosphere. You might call him an expert on what happens in the atmosphere. 12 scientists. Make sure you've read it before you let anybody tell you that there's no evidence. There's Jim. Ann Druffel's book about Jim is well worth reading. Here's Dr. J. Allen Hynek, The UFO Experience, a Scientific Inquiry. How was he qualified? He was a professor of astronomy at Northwestern University and the Air Force scientific consultant on UFOs for 20 years. He talks about 70 cases that couldn't be explained. It's funny, in a number of papers from the nasty, noisy negativists, the SETI cultists, they don't refer to Allen's book, even though he was the Air Force consultant for 20 years and even though he's a chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University. I call that selective choice of data. We can't let the debunkers get away with that kind of nonsense. And today, incidentally, you can get almost any of these books on Amazon. Good prices, too. Here's the University of Colorado study. We spent roughly $500,000 on this study under the direction of world-famous physicist Dr. Edward U. Condon. Well, didn't Condon show there were no flying saucers? No. You wouldn't know that from what Condon wrote. But the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the world's largest group of space scientists, had a UFO subcommittee, and no, they wouldn't let me on it because I had already reached a conclusion. I mean, after 11 years of study, you'd think I should reach a conclusion. They concluded that one could come to the opposite conclusions from Dr. Condon. Any phenomena with 30% unexplainable is well worth further investigation. That's right. 30% of the 117 cases studied in detail could not be explained. There's plenty wrong with the Condon report, but it's important to get the facts right about what they did find. There's my book, Flying Saucers and Science. I have some pictures of nuclear rocket engines, an aircraft nuclear propulsion system, stuff like that. And I raise all these questions, and I give answers to them. Here's our book on Science Was Wrong. If you want examples of prominent scientists saying stupid things, there's no shortage of them. There's Kathleen. She did half the work on that book and 85% of the work on the Hill story, Captured. This book, she's Betty's niece. She heard about the case the day after it happened. That's a lifetime of investigation. Here's another good book, Leslie Kean, UFOs. Important people, generals, scientists, and their reports. Dr. Bruce Maccabee, PhD, worked for Navy Research Labs, an expert on lasers. The FBI, CIA UFO files connection, if you will. He had no idea that when he made his first Freedom of Information Act request that he would get over 1,000 pages of stuff from the FBI, including many statements by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that we don't have anything to do with UFOs. A slight lie. A little white lie? No, I wouldn't call it that. You should read the book. Now, a little information. Claudius Ptolemy, that's the year 90 to 168. He knew that the earth was the center of the universe. Everything else revolves around it, right? No, wrong. Egos get in the way here. There's Copernicus. His book was banned for 300 years by the church because he said, no, Ptolemy was wrong. The sun is the center of the universe. 300 years the book was banned by the church because that couldn't be right. Everything goes around the earth, doesn't it? Isn't this the center of the universe? Well, no, frankly, it is not. There's Magellan. I don't know where they got that hat from, but 3 years his ship took. He didn't make it. Ran across a few natives who didn't like him on an island in the Pacific. 1523. That was an incredible event to go around the globe. No satellites to help you steer where you're going. There's a Corona spy satellite. I'm intrigued by the guys who had guts enough to build this thing, have 12 failures before one worked. That's persistence. And the idea of deorbiting the film and catching it basically in a big net by an airplane, it sounds like science fiction, but it worked. Here's the space station. A little different from Magellan's ship and Corona. One of my favorite ships, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Notice the small airplanes, and notice that the carrier, would you believe, can operate for 18 years without refueling. 18 years. No gas stations required. Those little airplanes can fly for about 2 hours without refueling. So you got your mothership and your little Earth excursion module. 2 different environments, 2 different modes of propulsion. It's a good analogy for what happens. We have nice reports of huge motherships in the sky. I don't know, I hadn't known until I finally saw this picture that somebody would paint that on a ship. Maybe we're trying to tell the Russians something. E equals MC squared times 40. I'll just touch on Majestic 12 because there's an awful lot of nonsense being published about it. This is a group established by President Truman in 1947 to deal with the Roswell crash and other stuff. This is one of the documents that turned up. And it's a perfect example of the bad thinking, how's that, of the nasty, noisy negativists. It's just a little memo telling General Nathan Twining, a member of the alleged MJ-12, that a briefing would take place during a scheduled meeting at the White House instead of after it. Now, Mr. Philip Klass, debunker extraordinaire, wrote me a letter about this one. Perhaps I hadn't noticed that it was done in the large pica type. But the National Security Council, which is mentioned in the upper left-hand corner there, NSC MJ-12, Special Studies Project, that they only use the elite type, he said, the small elite type. He had 9 samples to prove it. He challenged me to find any genuine memos, letters, done in the same size and style pica type. And because he put his money where his mouth was, he offered me $100 each for every genuine memo with the same size and style type, up to a maximum of 10. Now, the first thing I did was go to my files, because unlike him, he'd never been to the Eisenhower Library before or after this, but he knew what the documents were typed with, you know. I went to my files and pulled out 20 documents done in pica type. They didn't meet all his criteria, had to be signed in a certain time frame, et cetera, et cetera. He accepted 2. I was teasing him. I was going to the Eisenhower Library, so I immediately spotted 14, copied them, sent him an invoice for $1,000, and he paid me. He didn't tell anybody about paying me. He told people about challenging me. My colleague William Moore got 3 different letters from 3 different people. Hey, Bill, what about this from Phil? Interesting thing. Kathleen and I were just at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, which has Klass's papers. Funny, there's no Friedman file there. We corresponded for more than 20 years. Maybe this is why. He paid me $1,000. And then he got madder than hell when I included a copy in my final report on Operation Majestic 12. Threatened to sue me. And I told him that, Phil, you sent me a check. I Xeroxed it. I deposited the check at the bank. They cashed it. I can do whatever I darn please with the Xerox. So he shut up. But this is typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. It's malarkey. I'm sure there are people who still think that Phil challenged me and I didn't respond. Well, I responded. So incidentally, there's a good chance that some of this information will wind up at the library because they were interested in the truth. If you want interesting reading, look at Phil's FBI file. Oh boy. He said nasty things about J. Allen Hynek. And the FBI wasn't buying it, believe it or not. They had wanted to prosecute him for violating security twice, but the Air Force wouldn't declassify the documents involved, so they couldn't have a public trial. Not a nice man. Dr. Donald Menzel, a member of this Majestic 12 group, but a Harvard University professor of astronomy. How could he be a member of a group that knew all about crash saucers, alien spacecraft, all that sort of thing? Nonsense, I was told. Well, I went to the Harvard archives, had to get permission from 3 different people to look at his papers, and discovered to my total shock, because I didn't like him while he was alive, but then I found out he had a longer continuous association with the National Security Agency, NSA, and naval intelligence. Did all kinds of classified work for all kinds of organizations. Told President Kennedy, with whom he was well acquainted, that there was one area where he might be able to help him, son. He'd had a longer continuous association with the National Security Agency of anybody, more than 30 years. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. And people were still saying, Stan, he couldn't have been part of this group. He was a debunker. I'll give you 3 names: Burgess, Philby, and McLean. These are 3 guys who were Soviet spies who worked for British intelligence. Talk about living a secret life. I respect Menzel. His first book was translated into Russian. He was a writer of science fiction. Nobody knew that because they used pseudonyms. What better person to convince the Russians that there was nothing to UFOs? I think he got paid for debunking. I don't know whether Mr. Klass did or not. There's my book, Majestic Top Secret Magic, about Operation Majestic 12. And I've put out other publications, some of them in the MUFON Journal, in which I believe I destroy all the anti-MJ12 arguments. I'm saying there are loads of phony documents. They don't matter. There are a few real ones. They do matter. Ask the basketball coach, is everybody 7 foot tall? No, of course not. Give me one, he says. I don't care about the shorties. We have to look at it that way here. Movie rights have been granted for that book, Don Schmidt and I. And the same guy, Bryce Zabel, who has those movie rights, announced last week that it looks like the movie will be made out of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill story. And I'm excited about that because I think it would make a good story. I mean, Hollywood usually takes forever and most often doesn't get done what they want to do, but in this case, I think we're going to get there. I'm an optimist. Now, one of the most important documents not talked about by the debunkers, of course, General Carol Bolender. Reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. Was this just a casual comment? No. Condon had recommended in early '69 that Project Blue Book be closed. Wasn't contributing anything much to science or defense, and I agree with that. So they asked General Bolender, who was a good engineer working on a lunar excursion module, and yes, I believe we landed on the moon, asked him, what should we do about Blue Book? He wrote a memo, October 1969, in which he recommended that Project Blue Book be closed. And it was closed because of that memo. We didn't get a copy of that memo until 10 years later. Bob Todd got hundreds of documents declassified or released under Freedom of Information, and apparently I suspect this was a mistake. But anyway, 10 years later, the more detailed quote said, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. An extraordinary claim. We've always been told that Blue Book was it. I know it's hard to believe, but they were lying to us. 2 paragraphs later, he said, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. I managed to locate General Bolender and spoke to him and said, it sounds like you're saying there are 2 separate communication channels. He agreed with me. Now, if we can only get the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times to do their homework, it's easy to prove the Air Force has lied, even to U.S. senators. No national security aspect here, and Blue Book was it, and it's canceled, and all the stuff is available. Malarkey. Bolender's a hero as far as I'm concerned. He's dead now. You can't, well, some of you may be able to reach him, but I don't know how. In honor of Carol H. Bolender. Oh, here's your typical NSA top secret Umbra UFO document. You can read 1 sentence. Not very exciting. Here's your typical CIA top secret Umbra document. Only 6 words or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words are legible. Not very informative. And don't tell me scrape off the black and find out what's under it, because they Xeroxed it first. There's nothing under the black. Here's our book. It's entertaining reading. A good example of a cover-up, Bletchley Park in England. Fancy-looking place. They broke the German codes. They couldn't tell anybody they broke the codes, but they had 12,000 people at Bletchley Park, World War II, intercepting, decoding, translating, and very carefully releasing to those who had a real need to know. 12,000 people. You think they said anything when the war was over, even though this is extraordinarily important? Not a word. For 25 years, those people kept their mouths closed. 12,000 of them. Governments can't keep secrets? Baloney. Manhattan Project. To separate uranium isotopes, we built the gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It was a mile long. Pumped uranium hexafluoride gas through tiny holes in nickel plates, very carefully done stuff. The facility was a mile long. We used 5% of the electrical power being produced in the United States to pump that gas there. In secret. Can't keep secrets. More baloney. Stealth aircraft, as I said, $10 billion in 10 years. I just kind of like these. I do like that alien in the upper left-hand one, classified flight test. It's always nice to be recognized by your peers. That's what the local paper said, so I'm appreciative. And that sign says Roswell UFO Hall of Fame. I was admitted into that. Thanks very much for listening.